There's a weird moment last Friday and then leading into Saturday morning, heading into that Florida State Georgia Tech Week 0 game, where you saw a chorus of people suddenly start talking about Florida State having the best defensive line in the country. It was a strange sentiment because it wasn't something that most of us were saying all offseason. We thought they could be pretty good, but not the best in the country. And then Florida State goes out against Georgia Tech and gets just bullied by Georgia Tech's offensive line. Manhandled. So clearly not the best defensive line in the country. But who is the best defensive line in the country? Well, I think it's probably the one that most of us have been saying is the best D-line in the country all off season. Probably the team that had the best D-line in the country last season and brings back a lot of those really good players. I realize that's a pretty simplistic way of viewing it, but there's really no other way to say it. Michigan's the best D-line in the country. The two best interior defensive linemen in the country, potentially the two best, period. Like the two best in the whole country who happen to play next to each other, or if they didn't play next to each other, they still might be the two best. Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle. That's pretty rare. You don't often see that level of talent playing next to one another. You go that Georgia 2021 D-line had a pretty good example of that with Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter playing next to each other, but it doesn't happen very often. And usually when it does, it results in a national title, as it did for Michigan last year, as it did for Georgia in 2021. Now, Michigan has to replace a lot on offense. And I think that's probably the reason we're looking at Oregon and Ohio State as being the favorites in the Big Ten. But the way Michigan stays in that conversation, the way Michigan stays at the top of the Big Ten race, in the college football playoff conversation, potentially in the national title conversation, is that defense, and specifically that defensive line, keeps the Wolverines in it and allows the offense to adjust and figure out what it is. We don't know yet what that offense is going to be. Will it be Alex Orji starting at quarterback? Will it be Davis Warren? Those are two different offenses, essentially, depending on who you start. But we know what the defense is going to be, and we know they're going to be tough to run on with those two in the middle. We know it can generate a pass rush. And the pass rush piece of it is the part that makes it very interesting, because while Graham and Grant get most of the attention, and deservedly so, we haven't talked much about Josiah Stewart, about Derek Moore. And those are guys who, coming off the edge, could be problematic for opposing teams. And we saw it last year. Josiah Stewart was a transfer from Coastal Carolina who really came on the scene last year at Michigan. I talked to Jim Nagy, who's the executive director of the Senior Bowl, about Stewart recently. And he also brought up Derek Moore. And it's one of those things where you realize, oh, these guys together, like Graham and Grant, also very tough to deal with. And if you want to see one play that exemplifies it, it's that last play of the Rose Bowl. Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore blow up this play. Blow it up. If Jalen Milroe scores, or if he finds a way to get the ball to somebody who scores, then Alabama's probably your national champion right now. But those guys blew up that play in overtime of the Rose Bowl. You cannot come up bigger than that. And they were good all last season. So let's hear Jim Nagy talking Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore. You pointed this guy out the other day on Twitter, and I thought about it. I don't know if I've mentioned his name since the Rose Bowl. Well, maybe since the national title game. But Josiah Stewart at Michigan, the edge player at Michigan, blows up the final play of the Rose Bowl, helps Michigan beat Alabama. He was a Coastal Carolina transfer. Huge reason they won the national title last year. But I've spent all offseason talking about Will Johnson and Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham. But how important is Josiah Stewart to what Michigan does?
Really important, and so is Derek Moore. I mean, usually
the other guy who blew up that play.
Yeah, I mean those guys are really good players. And I was just up in Ann Arbor last week, so again, that's why some of the Michigan stuff is top of mind. I was in the building talking to those guys, and Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant have gotten a lot of love, right? Like they don't need it from me. They've gotten a lot of love. They know the Senior Bowl likes them. But you lose two edge players like Braden McGregor, who's having a great training camp so far with the Jets, and Jalen Harrell, same thing. I mean, he had 2 sacks the other night for the Tennessee Titans against the Seahawks. Most college teams lose 2 edge guys like that. They're in trouble. Now Michigan's going to, just elevate Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart into those roles and look out. And so, to me, Josiah, like digging into the tape, I posted a couple clips of this guy. Not the biggest guy in the world. He reminds me a little bit of Josh Uche from a couple of years ago, who had double-digit sacks 2 years ago for the New England Patriots. Josh had 11 sacks, and they're similar guys. And I remember Josiah going back 3 years ago. Coastal Carolina came here to town to play South Alabama, and I was out there to see Isaiah Likely, their tight end, who ended up playing the Senior Bowl and has become a really good player for the Baltimore Ravens. And that Coastal staff pointed him out. They're like, "You're going to be after this guy, in 2 or 3 years." He had 12 and a half sacks that freshman year. As a true freshman, I don't care if you're playing Division III ball or in the Power 5. You get 12 and a half sacks as a true freshman right out of high school. That's big time pass rush ability. So, and now here we are. Now he is a senior, and he's at Michigan. He's not at Coastal anymore, unfortunately for those guys. But he's a big time player. Guy had 5.5 sacks last year as a rotational piece at Michigan, and so to me, with more snaps this year and kind of a more prominent role, who knows? I think he and Derek Moore could both scratch double-digit sacks this year for that defense.
And if they do, this defensive line is going to be incredible because, again, we already know what Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant can do. If you haven't seen the video yet of Kenneth Grant running down Keytron Allen in the Penn State game last year, it's incredible. You've never seen a 330-pound dude run that fast. But that's who he is. Mason Graham, a complete technician at D tackle. So how is it that I can be this confident saying I think Michigan's going to be the best defensive line in the country, where you saw that same level of confidence with Florida State from different people last week, and then it gets completely obliterated in the first game? Well, that was a lot of extrapolation. Darrell Jackson Jr. was a transfer. We hadn't really seen him play. He'd only played 1 game for Florida State in the Orange Bowl last year. Marvin Jones Jr. was coming from Georgia. We hadn't seen him play with those guys. Joshua Farmer had played really well for Florida State, but we hadn't seen him with this group. We've seen this Michigan group play together already. They weren't always playing together last year because, again, there were some other good edges at Michigan that were older that also played. But we have seen this group play together, and it's been awesome. And they've had a year to get better. Michigan's going to be the best defensive line in the country. Whether Michigan's offense evolves to a point where having the best D-line in the country helps you win another national title or compete for another national title is another question. But Michigan's going to have the best D-line in the country. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On 3 Sports YouTube channel.